The letter arrived on a Tuesday in September of 1882, and it changed Ezekiel Hayes's life before he had even broken the wax seal. He was standing at the fence line of his father's ranch outside of Laramie, Wyoming, watching the first suggestion of autumn move through the cottonwood trees along the creek, when the boy from town rode up hard and handed him the folded envelope without a word. Ezekiel turned it over in his rough hands, saw the looping handwriting of Dr. Aldridge on the outside, and felt his stomach drop clean through the dry Wyoming earth beneath his boots. He already knew what the letter said before the words assembled themselves in his mind. He had known for weeks, the way a man knows a storm before the clouds appear, sensing it in the pressure of the air and the restlessness of the horses. His father, Cornelius Hayes, was not going to survive the winter. Dr. Aldridge had written it plainly and without apology, the way frontier doctors learned to communicate bad news, because softening it never changed the outcome and only prolonged the grief. The consumption had moved deeper into Cornelius's lungs than any treatment could reach. He might have weeks. He might have 2 months if the weather stayed mild. But the winter cold would be the thing that finished him, and Wyoming winters did not negotiate. Ezekiel folded the letter and pressed it flat against his chest for a moment, looking out at the land his father had broken his back over for 23 years. The ranch was modest by some measures, 140 acres of good grazing land with a creek that ran clear even in August, a solid barn with 12 stalls, a farmhouse that had been expanded twice as Cornelius's ambitions grew, and a bunkhouse where 2 hired hands, Clem and Bart, slept and argued about everything from horse breeding to the quality of biscuits. It was a good life. It was the life Cornelius Hayes had built from nothing after arriving in Wyoming Territory from Ohio in 1859 with $12 and a mule he had borrowed and never returned. Now Ezekiel walked back to the house, pushed open the heavy wooden door, and went to find his father. Cornelius was sitting in his usual chair by the south-facing window, where the afternoon light came in longest and warmest. He was 61 years old and looked 80, the sickness having hollowed him out from within, drawing the flesh from his cheeks and turning his strong hands into something fragile and bird-boned. But his eyes were still sharp and dark and fully present, the eyes of a man who had not yet surrendered anything more than his body. "You got the letter," Cornelius said. "It was not a question." "I got it," Ezekiel said. He sat down in the chair across from his father and set the letter on the small table between them. "Doc Aldridge says." "I know what Doc Aldridge says. I wrote him and told him to send you that letter." Cornelius coughed, the wet, rattling cough that had become the percussion of their days. He pressed a handkerchief to his lips, waited for it to pass, then lowered the cloth and looked at his son with those relentless eyes. "I want to talk to you about something before I get any worse." "You can talk to me about anything, Papa." Cornelius was quiet for a moment. Outside, a meadowlark sang from somewhere in the direction of the barn. "You're 28 years old, Ezekiel. You're a good man. You're probably a better man than I ever was, though I'll deny saying that if you repeat it to anyone." He paused. "But this ranch needs more than one person. It needs a family. It needs someone to help you keep it alive when I'm gone." Ezekiel studied the grain of the wooden floor. He knew where this was leading, and he was not sure how he felt about the destination. "You need a wife, son." "Papa, let me finish." Another cough, shorter this time. "I know you have your reasons for not having sought one out yet. I know that business with Clara Marsh 3 years ago left you with a sour taste. But Clara Marsh was not the last woman on the earth, and spending the rest of your days alone on this land is not the life I built this place for. I built it for a family." Cornelius reached out and laid one of those frail hands on Ezekiel's forearm. "I want to know before I go that you won't be alone. That there will be someone here with you. Someone to sit at this table with you come Christmas morning." Ezekiel looked at his father's hand on his arm and felt the full weight of everything that hand had done across 6 decades of living. It had hauled logs and dug fence posts and stitched wounds, and held Ezekiel's mother as she died of fever when Ezekiel was 9. It had braided leather and counted coins by lamplight and reached down to pull Ezekiel up out of more than one ditch of his own making. "I'll find someone," Ezekiel said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Before winter," Cornelia said. "I need your word on it before winter, not because I'm trying to rush you into something foolish, but because I would like to meet the woman who is going to share this home before I leave it." Ezekiel looked at his father for a long time. The meadowlark sang again. The cottonwood trees whispered. The afternoon light lay across the floor between them like something solid. "You have my word," Ezekiel said. "Before winter." Cornelius settled back into his chair with the careful, deliberate movement of a man conserving every calorie of strength. A small smile moved across the deep lines of his face. "Good. Now go find Clem and tell him the south pasture gate is hanging crooked again. I can see it from here, and it's been bothering me all week." Ezekiel managed a short laugh and pushed himself out of the chair. He went to do as he was told, the way he had been doing as he was told since he was old enough to hold a hammer, carrying the weight of his promise around his heart like a stone. The problem, as Ezekiel turned it over in the weeks that followed, was that finding a wife in Wyoming territory in 1882 was not as simple as walking into the dry goods store and selecting one from the shelf. He was not a man who visited saloons or dance halls. He went to church on Sundays in Laramie, but the congregation there was small and most of the unmarried women his age had either already found husbands or had made their intentions regarding Ezekiel Hayes perfectly clear across the past several years, which was to say they had made no intentions at all. He had considered briefly, and with some discomfort, the practice of advertising for a correspondence bride. Men did it, out here where women were scarce and loneliness was common as dust. They wrote to newspapers in the East or the Midwest, described their land and their circumstances and their character as favorably as honesty would allow, and waited to see if any woman was brave enough or desperate enough or adventurous enough to write back. It felt transactional in a way that sat uneasily with Ezekiel, but he was running out of ideas, and the calendar was running toward October with no regard for his discomfort. It was Clem who finally pushed him toward a decision, as Clem tended to push things, which was to say loudly and without much grace. "There's a notice board at the Laramie station," Clem said one morning over coffee, his broad, weathered face split by the particular grin he wore when he knew something useful. "Railroad posts notices there for all kinds of things. Heard from Abe Wheeler that there's a woman been asking around for work as a housekeeper or a teacher. Came in on the eastbound 2 weeks back and hasn't left. Don't know her name or her situation, but she's been staying at the Caldwell boarding house." Ezekiel said nothing, stirring his coffee. "I'm just saying," Clem continued, "that a woman who comes west and stays when she could leave is generally a woman with something to her." Bart, who was younger than Clem by a decade and quieter by a lifetime, nodded sagely from across the table. "Can't argue with that logic." Ezekiel looked out the kitchen window at the sky, which was the particular deep blue of early October Wyoming, clear and cold and absolutely merciless. "I'm not going to the boarding house to look at a woman like she's a horse at auction." "Then go to town for something else," Clem said. "Go to the hardware store. Go to the feed store. Go sit in the park if Laramie had a park, which it don't. Just go to town and let things happen natural." What happened was not entirely natural, but it was close enough. Ezekiel drove the wagon into Laramie on the following Thursday morning to pick up a crate of supplies from the railroad depot and to settle an account at Harmon's Feed and Grain. The morning was cold, the kind of cold that made the air taste like iron and made the horses blow white clouds with every breath. He completed his business at the depot, loaded the wagon, and was coming out of Harmon's when he saw her. She was standing in the middle of the street, which would have been remarkable enough given that the mud was substantial after 3 days of rain. But what made it more remarkable was that she was standing there holding a large carpetbag in one hand and a birdcage in the other, and the birdcage contained a canary of determined yellow, and the canary was singing at considerable volume, and the woman appeared to be arguing with it. "I know the accommodations are inadequate," she was saying to the bird in a low, measured voice that carried the clipped consonants of somewhere east of the Mississippi. "But I assure you that complaining about it will not improve the situation for either of us." The canary sang louder. Ezekiel stood on the boardwalk and watched this exchange with a feeling he could not immediately name. The woman was perhaps 25 or 26, with dark auburn hair pinned up severely beneath a hat that had seen better days, her face angular and intelligent and currently flushed with the cold, and with whatever emotion a person felt when arguing with a canary in the middle of a muddy Wyoming street. She was wearing a traveling dress that was practical rather than fashionable, dark blue wool with mud already at the hem, and she stood in that street like she was considering whether the mud or the canary was the greater in dignity. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Ezekiel said, surprising himself. She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were gray, the specific gray of sky before snow, and they moved over him with a directness that most people did not bother to deploy. She was not rude about it. She was simply precise. "I dropped my bag," she said, "and when I went to pick it up I stepped in the mud. And when I stepped in the mud I startled the canary, and now he won't stop. So unless you can speak canary, I'm not sure your help will be relevant." "I cannot speak canary," Ezekiel said. He stepped off the boardwalk and crossed to where she was standing, took the carpetbag from her hand, and offered his free arm. "But I can carry that while you navigate the mud." She studied him for another moment, then shifted the birdcage to her other hand and took his arm without ceremony. "Thank you. Ezekiel Hayes, I presume." He stopped walking. "How do you know my name?" "Clem Patterson came to the Caldwell boarding house 2 days ago on what he described as an errand for the feed store, but which I suspect was an errand for someone else entirely. He mentioned your name 3 times in a conversation ostensibly about whether I had tried the peach preserves Mrs. Caldwell makes." She glanced up at him with something that might have been amusement in those gray eyes. "He's not a subtle man, your hired hand." Ezekiel felt heat rise in his face despite the cold air. "I apologize. I didn't ask him to." "No, I don't think you did. That's what makes it rather charming." She stepped up onto the boardwalk and released his arm and turned to face him with the birdcage swinging gently from her hand. "I'm Lenora Vaughn. I came from Springfield, Missouri, 6 weeks ago. I've been looking for a position as a schoolteacher or a housekeeper, and I've found neither, and my funds are limited enough that I need to make a decision about my circumstances fairly soon." She paused. "I understand you may be in a similar position of needing to make a decision, so perhaps it would be worth having an honest conversation." Ezekiel Hayes had been raised by a man who valued directness above nearly everything else. He recognized it when he encountered it, and he felt something loosen in his chest at the sound of it coming from this woman in her muddy-hemmed dress with her singing canary. "Would you like to have coffee?" he asked. "I would," said Lenora Vaughn, "and perhaps somewhere I can put down this birdcage." They sat in the back of Mrs. Turnbull's small eating establishment on 3rd Street, which was warm and smelled of coffee and fresh bread, and was blessedly free of other customers at that mid-morning hour. The canary, whose name Lenora informed him was Copernicus, sat in his cage on the table between them and sang softly to himself, having apparently resolved his earlier complaints. Lenora Vaughn was 26 years old. She had grown up in Springfield, Missouri, the second of 4 children of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died of typhoid when Lenora was 12. She had taken over the management of her father's household at that age, and had managed it with considerable competence for the next decade, while also earning her own teacher's certificate and teaching at the local school for 3 years. Her father had remarried last year, a pleasant woman named Margaret who needed no managing, and Lenora had found herself both free and somewhat purposeless, which was a condition she found intolerable. A cousin in Denver had written to her about opportunities in the West, and Lenora had packed her trunk and her canary and boarded the train with the specific intention of finding a new life, which she acknowledged was a somewhat vague plan. "I know what you're thinking," she said, when she had finished telling him this, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. "You're thinking that a woman who comes west without a specific plan is either brave or foolish." "I'm thinking," Ezekiel said honestly, "that you sound like someone who makes decisions carefully and then commits to them without much fuss." Something shifted in her face. It was subtle, but he caught it, a slight softening around the eyes, a momentary lowering of the precise composure she carried. "That is a generous interpretation." "I try to be accurate rather than generous," he said. "They overlap more often than people think." He told her about his father then. He told her about Cornelius and the consumption, and the letter from Dr. Aldridge, and the promise he had made by the south-facing window while the meadowlark sang. He told her about the ranch and the land and the creek that ran clear in August and the barn with 12 stalls. He did not embellish, and he did not minimize. He told her what he was looking for and why, and he told her it was not a romantic courtship in the traditional sense, not yet, because there was not time for the traditional progression of things, and he would not insult her intelligence by pretending otherwise. He was looking for a woman willing to come to the ranch and meet his father and see if there was any foundation on which two people might build something. Lenora listened to all of this without interrupting, which Ezekiel found remarkable and refreshing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands. "I want to be equally honest with you," she said. "I did not come west to be a rancher's wife. I came west because I wanted to build something of my own. A school eventually, or at least to teach. That's what I care about. It's what I'm good at. I won't pretend that running a ranch house is the life I imagined." "I'm not asking you to give up what you want," Ezekiel said. "The nearest school to the ranch is 7 miles, and they lose teachers faster than they find them. Laramie itself needs teachers badly." She looked at him directly. "You would support that, a wife who teaches?" "I would expect it," he said. "A person who is good at something and stops doing it becomes a smaller person. I don't want a smaller life, and I don't want someone in my home who feels trapped." Another long silence. Copernicus offered a single bright note and then fell quiet, as though even the canary was listening. "I would need to meet your father," Lenora said, "and I would need to see the land. And I want to be clear that I am agreeing to visit and to consider, not to anything more than that." "That is entirely fair," Ezekiel said, "and Copernicus comes with me." "I would not dream of suggesting otherwise," Ezekiel said, looking at the yellow canary, who appeared to approve of this decision. He drove her out to the ranch the following Saturday in the wagon, with her trunk in the back and the birdcage on the seat between them, and the world around them so brilliant and cold and wide that it seemed almost theatrical, the way Wyoming sometimes did in October, showing off its distances and its hard beauty as though daring people to love it. Lenora sat straight-backed on the wagon seat and looked at everything. She did not make nervous conversation. She asked occasional questions about the land and the terrain with the systematic curiosity of a person cataloging information. How deep did the snow get in January? What were the primary crops? How many head of cattle? What were the particular challenges of winter on the ranch? He answered everything directly, and she nodded and filed the answers away somewhere behind those gray eyes. When the ranch came into view, the farmhouse white against the brown hills and the creek threading silver through the yellowed grass, Lenora said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "It's beautiful." She said it quietly, almost to herself, as though she had not quite intended to say it aloud. "It is," Ezekiel agreed. Cornelius Hayes was sitting in his chair by the south window when Ezekiel brought Lenora inside, and he looked at her with those dark, still sharp eyes for a long and somewhat uncomfortable moment before he said, "You're not what I pictured." Lenora set down her bag and met his gaze without flinching. "What did you picture?" "Someone softer," Cornelius said frankly. "Someone more decorative." "I see." Lenora sat down in the other chair without being invited, which Ezekiel could see surprised his father and which he himself found he admired. I'm afraid I am primarily functional, but I understand that is not always a disadvantage." Cornelius stared at her for another moment. Then he laughed, a real laugh that turned quickly into coughing and then settled into something that sounded almost like warmth. "Ezekiel," he said, when he had recovered himself, "go make us some coffee. The three of us need to talk." Ezekiel went to make coffee, and he could hear the low exchange of voices from the parlor as he did, his father asking questions and Lenora answering them with the same steady directness she had applied to everything else. He could not hear all the words, but he heard the cadence of it, and it had the quality of two people taking one another's measure with genuine respect, which was more than he had hoped for. When he came back with the coffee, his father was talking about Lenora's father being a schoolteacher, and Lenora was telling Cornelius about a particular book her father had read aloud to the family every Christmas, a collection of natural histories, and Cornelius was saying that he had always meant to read more and never had, the work always crowding out the intention, and there was something in his voice that was not performance, just a genuine and slightly wistful regret that a dying man had the luxury of expressing because there was no longer any point in pretending it wasn't there. "I'll read to you," Lenora said simply, "if you'd like, while I'm here, whatever you want to hear." The silence that followed this was not awkward. It was the silence of something settling into place. "I would like that," Cornelius said. She stayed for dinner that first day, and then because the hour was late and the drive back to Laramie was long and cold, she stayed the night in the spare room that had once been Ezekiel's mother's sewing room and still smelled faintly of lavender from some dried flowers long dried to dust in a forgotten drawer. She put Copernicus on the windowsill and the canary sang softly in the dark for a few minutes and then went to sleep, and Lenora lay on the narrow bed and listened to the Wyoming night, which was huge and full of wind and utterly unlike the nights she had grown up with in Missouri. She was not afraid. She was not certain either, but she was, she discovered, genuinely interested. In the land. In the man who had built nothing about himself for performance. In the old man in the parlor chair with his ruined lungs and his clear eyes and his willingness to be surprised by a woman who was not what he had pictured. In the morning, she helped Ezekiel make breakfast. They worked in the kitchen with a naturalness that startled both of them slightly, navigating the space with an efficiency that suggested a compatibility neither had expected from a first shared morning. She found the flour without asking where it was. He knew without her saying that she took her coffee without sugar. Neither of them remarked on any of this. They simply continued working. "How long were you planning to stay at the boarding house?" Ezekiel asked, setting plates on the table. "Until my money ran out," Lenora said, "which would have been approximately another 3 weeks." She paused. "And before you offer, I want to be clear that I would be contributing here. Not simply being housed. I will cook and clean and manage the household accounts if you'll let me see them, and when the teaching position opens at the school in Laramie, which it will because they always need teachers, I will pursue it." "I know," Ezekiel said. "I told you I would support that." "I know you told me. I wanted to tell you too." She looked at him across the kitchen. "So we're both clear." Cornelius was up early, coming to the kitchen on his own power, though Ezekiel watched his father's face carefully for signs of strain, and he ate more breakfast than he had managed in weeks, which Ezekiel noticed and which Lenora either also noticed or had the good sense not to comment on. After breakfast, while Ezekiel went out to work with Clem and Bart on the fence line that had been needing attention for 2 weeks, Lenora sat with Cornelius in the parlor and read to him from a volume of natural histories she had found on the shelf. A real one, worn and annotated in the margins in handwriting Ezekiel recognized as his mother's. Cornelius listened with his eyes half closed and the autumn light coming through the window and the canary on the table in his cage. And he looked, Ezekiel thought when he came back in for his noon meal and glanced through the parlor doorway, more peaceful than he had looked in months. The arrangement became, without any formal declaration, a trial. Lenora moved her trunk from the boarding house at the end of that week. She settled into the spare room with Copernicus on his windowsill perch, and she oriented herself to the rhythms of the ranch house with the systematic competence of a woman who had been managing a household since she was 12 years old. She learned the pantry and the larder. She learned which window stuck in wet weather and which floorboard in the hallway was loose and needed stepping around. She learned that Clem ate 4 biscuits to everyone that Bart ate, and that Bart made up for it in coffee consumption. She learned that Ezekiel rose before dawn every morning without exception and was always all ready at the barn by the time she came downstairs, and that he came in for noon meal with the particular directness of a man who had been working hard and was ready to eat without preamble. She read to Cornelius every afternoon for at least an hour. They went through the natural histories and moved on to a novel that Cornelius had been meaning to read for years, a copy of the Count of Monte Cristo that had been on the shelf since 1874. Cornelius found this delightful, the adventure and the revenge and the elaborate justice of it appealing to some quality in him that the illness had not yet extinguished. He asked questions and made commentary and occasionally fell asleep mid-chapter, and Lenora held her place with a finger and waited, and when he woke she continued from where she had stopped. Ezekiel would sometimes come in quietly and stand in the doorway and listen. He would not announce himself, not wanting to interrupt the reading, but Lenora always knew he was there, which she could not fully explain except that there was something in the quality of the air that changed when he was in a room. She kept her eyes on the page and kept reading and felt his presence behind her like sunlight coming through a window. In the evenings, after supper, they all sat together in the parlor, Cornelius in his chair and Lenora on the settee and Ezekiel in the other chair, and they talked about the day's work and the state of the range and things they had read and things they were thinking about. It was the kind of conversation that had texture to it, because 3 genuinely different minds were bringing different things to it, and Lenora found that these evenings were the best part of her days, which was not something she had anticipated when she sat across from Ezekiel Hayes and Mrs. Turnbull's eating establishment and agreed to visit and consider. She was considering. She knew she was, and she was arriving, slowly and without fanfare, at the beginning of a conclusion. About 2 weeks after she had moved to the ranch, Ezekiel asked her to ride the fence line with him on the south side of the property, because Clem and Bart were occupied with repairing the barn roof, and he needed someone to spot damage while he worked from horseback. Lenora told him she could ride, which he had not asked, and she went to the barn and saddled the horse he indicated, a steady gray mare named Hester, with a competence that made Clem, who was on the barn roof and watching, grin to himself and say nothing. They rode the south fence for 2 hours in the cold October air, and the work required enough concentration that conversation was intermittent and purposeful rather than sustained. But in the stretches between damaged posts and loose wire, they talked. About Missouri and about Wyoming, and about what it meant to inherit a piece of land, and what it meant to leave the place you grew up. About the specific loneliness of being someone who was capable and independent and still, at the end of the day, wanting another person to come home to. About books they had read and things they thought about, and the particular quality of the light in this part of Wyoming in October, which was something you had to see to understand. "Did you love her?" Lenora asked, at one point, and Ezekiel knew without asking whom she meant. He had mentioned Clara Marsh once in passing and had not elaborated, but it was the kind of thing that mattered, and Lenora was not someone who left important things unexamined. "I thought I did," he said. "She was beautiful and she was clever, and I was 25 and I confused admiration for love. She left for San Francisco with a railroad man, and I was more wounded than heartbroken, which told me something about the nature of what I had actually felt." "What did it tell you?" "That I had loved the idea of a future with her more than I had loved her specifically." He paused, looking out over the dry winter grass. "I'd like to do better than that." Lenora looked at him, and there was a quality in her face that he had not seen there before, a kind of careful attention that was different from her usual cataloging of information. "Yes," she said, "so would I." They rode back to the ranch in a silence that had warmth in it, which was different from all the silences that had come before. It was in the third week of October that the trouble came, as trouble tends to come in Wyoming, without much announcement and at an inconvenient hour. 3 men came to the ranch on a Wednesday morning, while Ezekiel was out at the far eastern pasture checking on 3 young steers that had been showing signs of illness. Clem was with him. Bart had ridden to town for supplies. Lenora was alone in the house with Cornelius. The men identified themselves as representatives of a land company out of Cheyenne, and they were polite in the way that men with a specific and practiced agenda sometimes manage to be polite, which is to say the politeness was a surface covering something rigid underneath. They said they were representing interests in the ranch's grazing land along the creek, that there was a question about the eastern boundary survey, and that they would need to speak to the owner. Lenora came to the door herself and stood in it in a way that closed off entry without being dramatic about it. She told them that Cornelius Hayes was unwell and not receiving visitors, and that Ezekiel Hayes would return within the hour. One of the men, the tallest one with pale eyes, said they would wait. Lenora said they would wait outside. The tall man smiled in a way that was meant to be pleasant but communicated something else entirely. She went back inside and locked the door, which she did not do dramatically, just calmly and with decision, and then she went to Cornelius and told him plainly what was happening. "The survey," Cornelius said, his voice tight. "It's come up before. There's a file in the desk in my office. The surveys going back to 1863. They're all legal and witnessed. Get them." She got them. She read through them quickly and efficiently at the desk, familiarizing herself with the relevant boundaries and the dates of registration, and she was back in the parlor with a solid command of the relevant facts when she heard Ezekiel's horse in the yard 20 minutes later. She watched through the window as Ezekiel rode in and saw the 3 men by the fence and stopped, and saw the way his posture shifted, not to aggression but to careful attention. He dismounted and spoke with them, and she could see from the angle of his shoulders that he was not surprised and not intimidated, just alert and measuring. The conversation in the yard lasted nearly 20 minutes. Lenora stood at the window and watched, holding the survey documents, and she saw the moment when Ezekiel turned toward the house and gestured, clearly indicating that the documentation was inside. She went to the door and opened it before he reached the porch. "I have the survey records," she said quietly. "Your father had me get them. The eastern boundary has been registered since 1869. Something passed through Ezekiel's eyes, a recognition of what she had done, the calm assessment and the preparation and the documentation retrieved before he had even known he needed it. He took the papers from her hands, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange, and held her gaze for a moment. "Thank you," he said. He said it simply, but it carried the weight of having noticed. He went back and showed the land company men the surveys, and they looked at them with the careful patience of people who had expected this and were calculating their next move, and then they folded up their papers and said they would be in contact with their client and rode away in the direction of Laramie. It was not resolved, but it was deferred, and sometimes deferral was the beginning of resolution. That evening after supper, when Cornelius had retired early and Clem and Bart had gone to the bunkhouse, Ezekiel and Lenora sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the survey documents spread out. She had organized them chronologically and made notes in a neat, compact hand on a separate sheet of paper, the key dates and registrations and names of witnesses laid out clearly. He sat across from her and read her notes and looked at the original documents and then looked at her. "You did all this afternoon?" he asked. "I had time while you were dealing with them in the yard. Your father's filing system is excellent, incidentally. Everything is exactly where it should be." He would be pleased to hear that. He paused. "You were calm." "Being calm was useful," she said. "Being otherwise wouldn't have been." He was quiet for a moment, watching her. "Lenora, Ezekiel, I need to ask you something directly. You may ask me anything directly. Are you happy here?" He said it in a way that indicated he meant it genuinely, not as a courtesy but as a real inquiry into a real question. Not comfortable, not managing, happy. Lenora considered this with the care she gave to all genuine questions. "I am. Better here than I have been in some time," she said slowly. "I am interested here, which I think is a prerequisite to happy. And I am," she stopped, looking at the lamp between them, its small flame very steady in the still kitchen air. "I am glad to be here, specifically here, which I did not entirely anticipate when I agreed to come." "I'm glad you're here," he said. It came out quieter than he intended, and it was honest in a way that surprised him slightly, because honesty of that particular caliber, the kind that admits to something the heart has been keeping, was not something he was accustomed to managing so straightforwardly. Lenora looked at him across the lamp. "Are you going to do something about that?" she asked, with the smallest suggestion of something that might have been a smile at the corner of her mouth. He reached across the survey documents and the neat notes and the lamp, and he covered her hand with his on the table. She looked down at their hands and then back up at his face, and the small suggestion of a smile became something more real and more quiet. "I'm working on it," he said. They stayed like that for a while in the warm kitchen, the wind moving around the eaves of the house, the lamp burning steadily between them, the canary asleep upstairs on his windowsill perch. Outside, the Wyoming night was vast and cold and indifferent to human feelings, which was its right. But inside there was warmth and light, and the beginnings of something that had no name yet but was acquiring the weight of something real. Cornelius got worse toward the end of October, the way the doctor had said he would. The cold moved into his lungs more deeply, and there were days when he did not leave his bed, and Dr. Aldridge came out from Laramie twice in 1 week and left both times with his quiet, direct face arranged in the expression that meant there was nothing more to be done but to be present. Lenora did not falter. She brought Cornelius his meals and his medicine, and she sat with him and read to them wherever they were in the Count of Monte Cristo. And she told him about what was happening on the ranch and what Clem had said about the cattle and what the weather was doing, and all the ordinary news that connected a bedridden man to the life continuing around him. She did it without sentimentality and without the particular terrible cheerfulness that some people deployed around the dying, which Cornelius found more exhausting than the illness itself. She was simply present and honest, and she talked to him the way she would talk to anyone whose opinion and attention she respected. One afternoon near the end of October, when the light was going early and the temperature outside was dropping towards something serious, Cornelius said, while Lenora was sitting beside his bed with the book open in her lap, "You love him." Lenora looked up from the page. She held his gaze for a moment. "I'm arriving at it," she said. "I think that's more honest than claiming I'm already there." Cornelius made a sound that was mostly a laugh. "That's an honest answer. I tend toward honest answers." "I know." He was quiet, his breathing labored but steady. "He loves you already. He's slow to admit things to himself, always has been, but when he gets there, he's there for good. His mother was the same way." Another pause. "She would have liked you." "What was she like?" Lenora asked, because she genuinely wanted to know. "Stubborn," Cornelius said. "Intelligent, not interested in being ornamental." He turned his head on the pillow to look at Lenora directly. "Not what I pictured when I was young and had ideas about what I was looking for in a wife. She was better than what I pictured." Lenora looked at him for a long moment, understanding the full meaning of what he was saying. "I see," she said softly. "We spent 30 years building something," Cornelius said. 30 years. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always peaceful, and there were years when the money was gone and years when the weather defeated us and years when we were too tired to remember why we were doing it. But there was never a single day when I wished I hadn't married her." He closed his eyes. "That's what I want for him." "That's what I want too," Lenora said. She was not performing the answer for his benefit. She meant it. Cornelius opened his eyes. "Good. Now read me the part where Dantes gets to Paris." I've been thinking about it all morning. She found the page and read to him until he fell asleep, and then she sat for a while longer in the quiet room with the book in her lap, and the sound of his breathing and the wind outside the window. And she thought about what it meant to build something across 30 years with another person, the particular enduring weight of that kind of commitment. And she thought about Ezekiel Hayes, who was at this moment in the barn or on the fence line or somewhere out in the cold doing the work that his father had built, and that he was now carrying forward. And she felt in her chest something that was very close to certainty. It came to a head on the first truly cold Sunday of November, which arrived with snow that began in the morning and accumulated through the afternoon into something that changed the look and feel of everything, blanketing the yard and the barn roof and the fence posts in white, making the ranch look like something out of a story. Ezekiel had come in from the barn at midday with snow on his coat and his hat, and he stood in the kitchen doorway shaking the snow from himself. And Lenora was at the stove making soup, because Sunday soup had become her contribution to the Sabbath on the Hayes Ranch, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of onions and herbs and the particular domestic warmth of a well-kept fire. Ezekiel stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she felt it without turning around. The snow came, she observed. It did. He came the rest of the way into the kitchen and took off his coat and hung it on the hook. First real snow. Clem says it'll last. Your father will want to see it from his window. I'll open the curtains. She turned then and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and the kitchen between them was warm and smelled of Sunday soup, and outside the snow was coming down over the ranch his father had built, and that Ezekiel was going to carry forward alone. And neither of them was alone in the kitchen, and they had known each other for only 6 weeks, and it felt like considerably longer and also not long enough. I want to talk to you about something, Ezekiel said. All right, Lenora said. She did not turn back to the stove. I know that the arrangement when you came here was to visit and consider. And I know I told you I wasn't looking for a romantic courtship in the traditional sense because there wasn't time. But I want to. He stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment, which was the only outward sign of anything other than composure, and then he looked back at her. I want to do this properly, whatever that looks like given everything. I don't want you to stay because it's practical. I want you to stay because you want to be here, because you want. He stopped again. Because I want you, Lenora said, completing the sentence he was working toward. She said it directly, the way she said everything, and she felt her heart move in her chest as she said it, a large and deliberate movement. The silence lasted exactly long enough for both of them to understand what had just been said. Then Ezekiel crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and took her face in his cold hands, still cold from the snow and the outdoor work, and she reached up and held his wrists, and he kissed her in the warm kitchen with the snow coming down outside, and the soup on the stove and the canary upstairs and his father in the next room, and it was nothing like the kiss of 2 people performing the expected gesture. It was the kiss of 2 people who had been paying close attention to one another for 6 weeks and had arrived, through that attention, at something real. When he stepped back, his hands were still at her face and her hands were still at his wrists, and they were both slightly breathless in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. I want you to stay, he said. His voice was low. I'm staying, she said. They were married by the Reverend Thomas of the First Methodist Church in Laramie on the 14th of November, 1882, on a day that was cold and clear and absolutely brilliant, the sky the deep blue of Wyoming at its most emphatic. Clem and Bart were present, Clem wearing his best shirt and looking uncomfortable in it, and Dr. Aldridge was there as a witness, and Cornelius Hayes was there, wrapped in his coat and his blanket and brought to the church in the wagon by Ezekiel with careful and meticulous attention, because Cornelius Hayes was going to watch his son get married if it was the last thing he did, and everyone involved understood the particular weight of that intention. Lenora wore a dress of dark green wool that she had purchased with some of the last of her funds in Laramie the previous week, and she had her hair done differently than usual, softer around her face, and she stood in the small church with the winter light coming through the plain windows, and she held Ezekiel's hands and said the words she had decided she meant. And Ezekiel Hayes, who did not look away from her face throughout the entire ceremony, said the words he had decided he meant. And Reverend Thomas pronounced them married, and Clem clapped hard enough to be heard outside the church. Cornelius, in his bundled-up chair in the front pew, said nothing. But when Ezekiel turned to him after the ceremony, the old man's eyes were bright with something that was beyond what illness does to the eyes. That was the eyes themselves, alive and present and full of everything they had witnessed across 61 years. "Good," Cornelius said. Just the one word, but it carried the full weight of a man who had gotten what he needed before he left. The land company matter was resolved in December, before the deep of winter settled in fully, when Ezekiel brought the survey documents to the county recorder in Laramie and registered them formally in a process that Lenora helped him organize and prepare, having written a clear account of the document's history and legal standing that the recorder described as the most useful submission he had received in 3 years. The land company withdrew their interest. The boundary stood where it had always stood. That was the end of that. Cornelius Hayes died on the 22nd of December, 1882, 10 days before the new year. He died in his own bed in his own house on the land he had built, with Ezekiel on one side of him and Lenora on the other, and the canary was downstairs in the parlor, and it had been a clear night until just before the end. And then the snow began to fall, quietly and without apology, the way Wyoming winter does. Ezekiel sat at the kitchen table after, when everything that needed to be done had been done, and the house was very quiet, and Lenora sat beside him and put her hand over his, and they remained like that for a long time without speaking. There was nothing that needed to be said. There was only the grief and the fact of it, and the warm kitchen, and 2 people who had found each other in time for something to matter. He wept once, briefly and without drama, and she held him with a straightforward and complete tenderness that asked nothing of him and required nothing of her except presence, which she gave without reservation, because that was who she was. They buried Cornelius beside Ezekiel's mother in the small fenced cemetery on the eastern edge of the property, where the cottonwood trees made a border, and the view of the creek was clear on fair days. The headstone was simple and good, and said what needed to be said. Clem and Bart were there, and Dr. Aldridge and Reverend Thomas, and a handful of neighbors who had known Cornelius Hayes across the decades and came to pay what was owed. When the service was finished and the others had gone, Ezekiel and Lenora stood alone at the graves for a while, the winter cold clean and cutting around them. Ezekiel had his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they both looked at the 2 stones side by side and thought about 30 years of building something together, and the weight of inheritance, not just of land and cattle and a farmhouse with a sticking window, but of what 2 people make when they commit to making it. "What he said about your mother," Lenora said quietly, "about never wishing he hadn't married her." "I know," Ezekiel said. "I want that too. We're going to build it," she said, "not a wish, a declaration." "I know we are," he said, and he believed it. Winter settled fully over the ranch and they settled into it together. There was more work in winter than people who didn't know ranch life tended to expect. The feeding of animals and the maintenance of structures, and the vigilance required to keep pipes from freezing and cattle from drifting too far in blizzards. Lenora learned the specifics of winter ranch work with the same systematic attention she had brought to everything else, and she proved, to no one's particular surprise, to be excellent at it. She was physically capable in the way that practical people raised without luxury tend to be, and she had a high tolerance for cold and for sustained effort, and she was not someone who complained about discomfort when complaining would not improve the situation. She also wrote to the superintendent of schools in Laramie in January, formally inquiring about teaching positions for the following school year. The superintendent wrote back within 2 weeks to say that yes, there would be a position available at the Laramie school beginning in September, and that her credentials were exactly what they needed, and would she be available to meet in February to discuss the particulars. She told Ezekiel about the letter over supper and watched his face as she did. He listened and then he smiled at her, a full and genuine smile that she was still cataloging, still finding new dimensions of, and said, "Write back and say yes. You're sure?" Lenora. He said her name the way he always said it, with a kind of deliberate attention, like each syllable was worth the time it took. "I told you before you came to this ranch that a person who is good at something and stops doing it becomes a smaller person. I meant it then and I mean it now. You're going to teach in September." She looked at him across the table. "I love you," she said. It was the first time she had said it directly, in those exact words, having been arriving at it for months, and having arrived, fully and without reservation, sometime in December, she thought. Though she could not pinpoint the exact moment because it had not been a single moment but an accumulation of moments, the way a creek fills not from one rain but from a season of them. He looked at her with an expression that was not composed and was not performing anything at all, just entirely open, which was a significant thing for a man who had learned to keep himself gathered. "I love you," he said back. "I've been loving you since you argued with your canary in the middle of a Laramie street." She laughed, which startled Copernicus in his cage into a brief burst of song, and then they were both laughing in the way that people who have been grieving and working hard and carrying serious things laugh when they find the release of something genuinely light, which is to say fully, and with the relief of it. Clem, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway looking for a second cup of coffee, took one look at the two of them laughing at the table and turned quietly around and went back to the bunkhouse and told Bart he could make his own coffee, and grinned to himself in the cold night air on the way back. The spring came to Wyoming in the slow, reluctant way it always did, fighting against the memory of winter for weeks before finally prevailing, and the ranch came alive with the particular energy of spring on working land, the calving and the planting and the fence mending, and the 10,000 things that the season demanded. Ezekiel worked from before dawn until after dark most days, and Lenora worked beside him or ahead of him, or separately in whatever direction needed attending, and there was a quality to the work that was different from anything Ezekiel had known before, which was the quality of having a partner who was fully present and fully capable and fully committed to the same thing he was committed to. They had disagreements. Of course they did. Lenora had strong opinions about the household accounts and believed Ezekiel was too generous in extending credit to neighboring ranchers who had a history of slow repayment. Ezekiel thought Lenora sometimes approached emotional situations with a pragmatism that was effective, but that occasionally missed the human texture of a thing. They argued about both of these things, on separate occasions, with the directness that their natures required, and they resolved both of them, on separate occasions, through the equally direct process of listening to one another, without the intention of simply waiting for the other to finish speaking. Their first real argument, the one that had genuine heat in it, was about the water rights to the creek in the east pasture, where a neighboring rancher named Garfield Webb had begun to run a small dam that diverted a portion of the flow in a way that affected the Hayes cattle's access in dry months. Ezekiel wanted to deal with it quietly, neighbor to neighbor, over time. Lenora thought they should address it formally and immediately, before the diversion became established enough to constitute precedent. "If you let Garfield Webb think this is acceptable," she said, in a tone that was controlled but very firm, "you will spend the next 10 years managing the consequences." "Garfield Webb has been my neighbor for 15 years, Ezekiel said with equal firmness. "I'm not going to march over there with a legal document before I've even had a conversation with him. Have the conversation, immediately, and have it clearly so he understands that the diversion is not something you're prepared to accept as a permanent arrangement. They looked at each other across the kitchen table for a charged moment. "You're right that it needs to be addressed quickly," Ezekiel said. "You're right that it should start with a conversation," Lenora said. Another pause. "This week," he said. "This week," she agreed. He went to see Garfield Webb the following Tuesday, and he had the conversation directly and clearly and without hostility. And Garfield Webb, who was a reasonable man and had acted out of convenience rather than malice, agreed to modify the dam to restore the original flow, and that was the end of that. And Ezekiel told Lenora about it that evening, and she nodded and said, "Good," and then said, "You were right to do it yourself." And he said, "You were right that it needed to happen quickly," and they left the argument fully resolved and did not revisit it. This, Ezekiel reflected, was what it looked like to build something with a partner who was equally invested in the building as in being right, which was a distinction that made all the difference. The summer of 1883 was dry and demanding, but the ranch came through it in solid condition, the creek holding its level better than it had in years, the cattle healthy, the fencing maintained. Clem and Bart stayed on, and Ezekiel hired a third hand in July, a young man named Elliot from up near Casper who had grown up on cattle ranches and knew his work, and who was welcomed into the bunkhouse company without much ceremony. The Hayes Ranch was functioning at a level of efficiency and organization that it had not achieved even in Cornelius's best years, and the difference was mostly Lenora, who approached the household and the accounting and the supply management with the systematic rigor of a woman who had been thinking about how systems worked since she was old enough to run one. She also began preparing for the teaching position in earnest through the summer, going to Laramie once a week to meet with the superintendent and to set up the classroom and to arrange the materials she would need. She came home from these trips energized in a specific way that Ezekiel recognized as the energy of a person doing something they were built for, and he watched it in her with a feeling in his chest that was both admiration and the deep satisfaction of having kept his word to himself about not wanting someone in his home who felt trapped. She was not trapped. She was expanding, and the ranch expanded with her, the way things do when the person tending them is genuinely alive. On a September evening, 3 days before the school term began, they were sitting on the porch after supper, which had become a habit in the warm months, watching the long sunset do its particular Wyoming theatrical display of color over the hills. Copernicus was in his cage just inside the open door, offering intermittent commentary. "I have something to tell you," Lenora said. He looked at her. Her profile was turned toward the sunset, and she had that composure she always had, but there was something different underneath it, a particular quality he had learned to recognize as something she was working out how to say. "I believe I'm expecting," she said. The sunset continued its performance over the hills. Copernicus offered a single note. Ezekiel reached over and took her hand, and she turned to look at him, and her face had the careful, slightly alert expression of a person who has said an important thing and is waiting to understand what effect it will have. "When?" he asked. "March, I think. I'll see Dr. Aldridge in town when I go in for school." He looked at her hand in his, at the ranch spread out before them in the evening light, at the sky his father had looked at for 23 years and that he had looked at for his entire life, and that felt, at this moment, larger than usual in the particular way that important moments expand the space around them. "My father would have been so pleased," he said. His voice was not entirely steady, which he did not try to correct. "I know," she said gently. She squeezed his hand. He turned and looked at her fully then. His wife. This woman who had been arguing with a canary in the middle of a Laramie street 13 months ago, and who was now carrying his child and starting a teaching career, and keeping the accounts of his ranch in the neat, precise handwriting he had come to know as well as his own. This woman who was not soft and was not decorative, and was not what anyone would have pictured if you had asked them to picture a rancher's wife for Ezekiel Hayes, and who was nevertheless exactly and precisely right. "I love you," he said, "to the full extent of what that means." She looked at him with those gray eyes, the ones that had taken his measure in the first 2 seconds of their acquaintance and had not stopped paying attention since. "As do I," she said, "to the same full extent." They sat on the porch until the light was gone and the stars came out over Wyoming, which was a sight worth sitting for, the stars out here being unpolluted by anything, and therefore relentless in their number and their brightness. And the evening air was warm enough still to be comfortable, and they held hands in the dark and neither of them needed to say anything more. She taught school. She began the term 3 days later, and she was, by every available measure, an excellent teacher. The children of Laramie and the surrounding ranches arrived in her classroom speaking in the incomplete and approximate way that children in under-resourced frontier schools often did, having had teachers who were well-meaning but transient. And Lenora Hayes applied herself to the matter of their education, with the same systematic rigor she brought to everything else. By November, parents were stopping Ezekiel in town to tell him his wife had taught their child to read in 2 months when nobody had managed it in 2 years. And Ezekiel would say thank you, and mean it in a particular way that contained also the private pleasure of having known exactly what she was capable of since the first morning they had made breakfast together in the ranch kitchen. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was brutal, which is the only word Wyoming weather sometimes deserves, the kind of winter that tested the preparation and character of every structure and every person on the frontier. Ezekiel and his hands worked days and nights to manage the cattle through the worst of it, losing 2 steers to the cold, but saving the rest through vigilance and sustained effort that left all of them exhausted in the particular deep way that only sustained physical effort in extreme cold can accomplish. Lenora, who was well into her pregnancy through the worst months, managed the house and the supplies with a calm efficiency that impressed even Clem, who was not easily impressed by anything and said so freely. She kept the household fed and warm and organized through 2 weeks of temperatures that dropped below what the thermometer in the kitchen could accurately record, and she was never once the person anyone needed to worry about, which freed Ezekiel and the hands to focus their worry on the cattle, which was where it needed to be. She stopped teaching in January, when the roads became too uncertain for the 7-mile trip in her condition, but she continued her correspondence with the superintendent and with several of the children's parents, sending written lessons home with families who came into Laramie, which the superintendent said was unprecedented and completely in keeping with everything else about Mrs. Hayes. The baby came in early March 1884, as the first whisper of spring was beginning its negotiation with the end of winter, and it came in the way that first babies tend to come, which is to say urgently, and without much regard for anyone's plans or preferences. Dr. Aldridge was there, having ridden out the 20 miles from Laramie in cold rain, and Clem and Bart and Elliot were nowhere to be seen, having removed themselves to the barn with the focused avoidance of men who understand that certain events are not their territory. Ezekiel stayed. He had not considered not staying, and Lenora had not suggested otherwise, and Dr. Aldridge, who had seen most things in 30 years of frontier medicine, noted the quiet steadiness of Ezekiel Hayes through the process, and thought that this was a man who had found a marriage equal to himself. The baby was a boy. He came into the world in the early evening, with the rain on the windows and the lamp lit in the bedroom, and Lenora doing the extraordinary work of bringing a new person into existence with the same focused determination she brought to everything she attempted. When it was done, and the boy was laid in her arms, and Ezekiel was sitting beside the bed with her hand in his, they looked at their son together for the first time. He was wrinkled and red and loudly declarative about his presence, and he was the most astounding thing either of them had ever seen. "Cornelius," Lenora said. She looked at Ezekiel as she said it. He was not composed. He made no attempt to be. Yes, he said. They named him Cornelius James Hayes, James for Lenora's father, and the baby received this name with the indifference that very new babies have toward most things that are not immediate warmth and sustenance. Copernicus, informed of the development via the canary's general awareness of unusual household energy, sang at some length from his cage in the corner of the bedroom, which Dr. Aldrich said was the most unusual birth announcement he had ever witnessed. Young Cornelius, who was called Neil almost immediately and would answer to Neil for the rest of his days, was a sturdy and determined baby who resembled his father in the heaviness of his brow and his mother in the precision of his gaze, which fixed on people with a directness that was startling in an infant, and explained itself as the child grew into a boy who had inherited both his father's capability and his mother's systematic way of understanding the world. Lenora returned to teaching in September of 1884, when Neil was 6 months old, and the arrangements at the ranch were organized accordingly, with a neighbor woman named Pearl coming in 3 days a week, and the other 2 days managed between Lenora's own schedule and Ezekiel's flexible presence during those hours. It required coordination of the kind that 2 organized people can manage, and they managed it, as they managed most things, through the combination of clear communication and a shared commitment to making it work. The years that followed were the years of building. There is no single moment in which a life becomes what it is going to be. It becomes itself through the accumulated weight of ordinary days stacked upon one another, the mornings at the kitchen table and the evenings on the porch, the decisions made and the arguments had and resolved, and the work done in every season. The ranch grew. They purchased an additional 60 acres along the eastern boundary in 1886, resolving once and for all the question of the survey lines that the land company had attempted to exploit 4 years before. Clem and Bart stayed on, and Elliot became a permanent fixture, and Ezekiel added a second hired man in 1887 as the cattle operation expanded. The barn was rebuilt and enlarged. The farmhouse was extended for the second time since Cornelius had built it. A new room added on the south side where the light came in longest, which Lenora used as her study, and where her books accumulated alongside her teaching materials and the letters she exchanged with her father and her siblings in Missouri. She taught for 11 years at the Laramie school, and in 1893 she became the head of the school, which was not a position that had previously been held by a woman in Albany County, Wyoming, and which she undertook with the same deliberate competence she had brought to every other thing she had attempted. The superintendent who hired her for that position wrote in his annual report to the territorial school board that the school under Mrs. Hayes's direction had achieved the highest student achievement metrics in the county, which he attributed to her insistence on both rigorous standards and individual attention to each student's particular learning needs, which was a more sophisticated pedagogical approach than most territorial schools had managed. Ezekiel read this report, which Lenora had set on the kitchen table, without comment, and he looked at her across the table and said, "Are you proud of yourself?" "Yes," she said, without qualification or false modesty. "Good," he said. "You should be." They had 3 children. Neil, born in 1884, and then a daughter, Clara Jane Hayes, born in 1887, named for no one in particular and given the middle name Jane because both parents liked the solidity of it. And then in 1890, another son, who they named Thomas, for no one except that it suited him from the first look. The children grew up on the ranch with the particular combination of freedom and expectation that such places produced, the freedom of wide open land and physical competence and independence, the expectation of work and responsibility, and the understanding that a ranch was a living thing that required everyone's contribution. Neil was a serious, steady boy who loved cattle with an uncomplicated devotion, and began understanding the operation of the ranch with genuine comprehension earlier than Ezekiel had dared to hope. Clara Jane was more like Lenora in the precision of her mind, less interested in the cattle and more interested in the books that lined the study shelves. And by the age of 7, she was reading at a level that prompted Lenora to correspond with the school superintendent about the appropriate response to exceptional student aptitude. Thomas was something both his parents and neither of them, physically fearless and intellectually curious, and possessed of a humor that was present from such an early age that Clem declared it must have been born in him, which was probably correct. Copernicus the canary lived to the remarkable age of 14 years, which was exceptional even for a well-kept canary. And when he died on a spring morning in 1896, Lenora sat in the study for a while with the empty cage and felt the particular grief of a creature who had been her companion through the most significant transition of her life. Ezekiel came in and sat beside her without saying anything for a while, and then he said, "He was a very good canary. He was opinionated and vocal and entirely convinced of his own importance," Lenora said. "Yes," Ezekiel said, "those were his best qualities." She laughed, which was what she needed, and she put away the cage and they went on with the day. Clem retired in 1897 at the age of 63 and went to live with his sister in Cheyenne. And there was a dinner in his honor at the ranch that included every hand who had worked for the Hayes Ranch in the past 15 years. And the food was extraordinary because Lenora had cooked it with the help of Pearl, who had become over the years less a hired woman and more a fixture of the household. And there was a great deal of laughter and some stories that were somewhat embellished, but not dishonestly so. Ezekiel gave Clem a handmade tooled leather saddle that he had commissioned from the best saddle maker in Laramie and paid for over 4 months. And Clem received it with the gruffness of a man who was moved and was absolutely not going to say so, which everyone present understood. After Clem left, when the guests had all gone and the house was quiet, Lenora and Ezekiel sat on the porch in the May evening, and Ezekiel was thinking about time in the way that middle age teaches you to think about time, which is to say with a respectful awareness of how much of it has passed and how much it contained. "He called you not what he pictured," Ezekiel said. "My father, the first time he met you." "He did," Lenora said. She remembered it with perfect clarity. The day she had walked into the parlor of this house for the first time with her carpetbag and her canary and met those dark, sharp eyes. "He told me after that first day," Ezekiel said, "that you were exactly what I needed, which was apparently different from what he had pictured needing." Lenora looked at him. He was 43 years old, and he wore his years the way good land wore its seasons, with depth and without apology. The line of his face was settled into something that had no pretense left in it, just the clear grain of a man who had become fully himself across the years of his living. "What did he picture?" she asked. She was curious. She had always been curious. Someone who would fit easily into the life the ranch required, someone comfortable, someone who wouldn't complicate things. And instead he got me. And instead he got you. Ezekiel reached over and took her hand in the May evening, and his hand was the hand of a man who had worked hard his whole life, and hers was the hand of a woman who had done the same, and they fit together with the particular rightness of things that have been in contact long enough to have shaped one another slightly. "He told me the week before he died that you were the best thing that had happened to me since I was born on this land." Lenora was quiet for a moment. The May evening was warm and soft around them, and the cottonwood trees along the creek were in full leaf, and from inside the house there came the indistinct sounds of the children, Neil and Clara Jane and Thomas, moving through the evening with the unconscious ease of children who have never known anything but a home that held them well. "He was a wise man," she said. "He was," Ezekiel agreed. "He knew what he needed before he knew what he wanted." They sat in the May evening as the light went slowly down over the hills in all the colors that Wyoming saved for its best performances, and the creek ran silver in the distance, and the ranch that Cornelius Hayes had built from $12 and a borrowed mule in 1859 lay around them in the evening, full of all the years it had held, and all the years it still had ahead of it. Inside, Neil's voice said something, and Clara Jane's voice responded, and Thomas laughed at something. And the sound of it came through the open door and out onto the porch where Ezekiel and Lenora sat. And it was the sound of the future, which was exactly and precisely what Cornelius Hayes had wanted when he had pressed his son for a promise before the winter came. The winter had come. Cornelius had gone. The promise had been kept. And what had grown from it was immeasurably more than either Cornelius Hayes or Ezekiel Hayes had pictured, because Lenora Vaughn had always been more than anyone pictured, which was both her gift and the gift she had given them all. The following years deepened into something that had the quality of permanence without being static. Neil, who had loved cattle with an uncomplicated devotion since boyhood, began formally managing significant portions of the ranch operation by the time he was 16, and by 19, he was negotiating cattle sales with buyers from Cheyenne with a composure that made buyers assume he was older. He had Cornelius's eyes, the dark, sharp ones, and he used them with the same relentless attention that his grandfather had, and that his mother had transferred to him through the peculiar alchemy of observation and example. Clara Jane went east to study in 1905, when she was 18, to a women's college in Pennsylvania that Lenora had researched with the same thoroughness she had brought to every other project of her life. Ezekiel drove her to the station in Laramie himself, and the family stood on the platform in the September morning, and Clara Jane embraced her mother and her father and her brothers. And when the train pulled away, Lenora watched it with a face that was composed and full at once, the face of a woman who had given everything she could to a person and was watching that person go and use it. On the drive back to the ranch, Ezekiel said, "She'll be fine." "Of course she will," Lenora said. She paused. "She's better than fine. She's exceptional. She learned from an exceptional person." Lenora looked out at the Wyoming landscape passing by, the same landscape she had first seen from this same road 23 years before, watching it go past with the systematic curiosity of a woman cataloging what she was arriving at. "We learned from each other," she said. Thomas, the youngest, turned out to be the one most drawn to the land itself, less to the cattle operation than to the land. And by the time he was 20, he had begun a practical study of soil and water management that was ahead of most of what Wyoming farmers were applying at the time. And he read everything he could find on the subject and corresponded with an agricultural scientist in Fort Collins, Colorado, who eventually visited the Hayes Ranch and declared that Thomas Hayes had arrived at several useful conclusions through direct observation that confirmed what academic research was only beginning to formalize. This pleased Thomas in the specific way that being right pleases people who care more about being right than about being acknowledged for it, which was a quality he shared with his mother, and which his father recognized with a mixture of affection and resigned amusement. In 1908, Neil married a young woman named Ruth Pearson from outside Cheyenne, a rancher's daughter who was steady and warm, and who came to the Hayes Ranch on the occasion of her introduction to Lenora and Ezekiel, and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked around at the warmth of it, the books on every available surface and the organized neatness and the evidence of decades of deliberate living, and said, "I hope I can make something like this." Lenora looked at her with those precise gray eyes and said, "You will," and meant it. Ruth Pearson had good instincts and a genuine capacity for love that would serve her well, which Lenora could assess accurately in approximately the same time it had taken her to assess Ezekiel Hayes across a plate of food in Mrs. Turnbull's eating establishment in October of 1882. The ranch passed formally to Neil in 1910, not because Ezekiel was done with it, but because the time had come and Neil was ready, and Cornelius Hayes had always intended this land to move forward into the future. And the future had a name, and it was Neil Cornelius Hayes, and everyone agreed this was correct. Ezekiel and Lenora moved to a smaller house they had built on the south side of the original property, close enough to the ranch house to be present and far enough to be separate, which was the right balance. From the south window of this house, which caught the afternoon light longer than any other window, you could see the original farmhouse and the barn and the creek threading through the cottonwoods and the hills beyond. And the view was the same that Cornelius had looked at across 23 years, which was something Ezekiel thought about each time he sat in the chair he had placed beside that window. Lenora retired from the school in 1910 as well, after 27 years of teaching, which was a span of years that had produced 3 generations of Laramie students who could read and think and reason with a rigor that the county school records reflected with consistent and remarkable clarity. The superintendent, who was by this point a different superintendent from any who had originally hired her, organized a reception in her honor to which the school board and half the town of Laramie came, and several of her earliest students, now grown adults with children of their own, stood and spoke about what her teaching had meant to their lives. Ezekiel sat in the front row at this reception and watched his wife receive this tribute with the same composure she had always had, the composure that was not distance but containment, that held large feelings with a firm and deliberate hand. And he saw the moment when she was not quite composed, when a woman who had been her student in 1884 stood up and said that Mrs. Hayes had taught her to believe that her mind was worth using, and the fullness of that crossed Lenora's face for just a moment. The full weight of 27 years of students who were better for having sat in her classroom, and her eyes were bright, and she held herself very still, and then she was composed again. He reached over and took her hand. She pressed his without looking away from the woman who was speaking, but the pressure said everything it needed to say. They were 60 years old together in 1916, having not been born in the same year, but having arrived at the decade together close enough to observe it jointly. And they marked it not with ceremony, but with a long ride along the fence line of the south pasture on a November morning, the same fence line they had ridden together in October of 1882 when the air was cold, and they were talking about love and loneliness, and what it meant to inherit a piece of land. The horses were different horses. The fence was the same fence, repaired and extended and repaired again over the decades. The landscape was the same landscape, though it had weathered its years as all things do, the creek bank a little changed in its course, the cottonwoods taller and thicker along the water's edge, the hills beyond the same hills under the November sky that was the same deep blue it had always been. They rode without urgency, not checking for fence damage this time, but simply moving through the land that had been the location of their entire shared life, 34 years of it, and there was no need to speak constantly because they had spoken constantly for 34 years, and had also learned the quality of silence that is its own kind of conversation. At the south corner post where the fence turned east toward the creek, Ezekiel stopped his horse. Lenora stopped hers beside him. Below them, the creek ran clear in the way it ran clear even in November, which was one of its particular qualities, and the cottonwood trees were bare now, their branches against the sky like careful drawings of themselves. "I want to tell you something," Ezekiel said. Lenora looked at him. Her hair was gray now, which it had been for a while, and she wore it differently than she had at 26, more simply, and her face had the lines of a woman who had spent decades doing things that mattered, which were different from other kinds of lines. She was still the most interesting person he had ever sat across a table from, which was the thing that sustained a marriage across decades more reliably than anything else he could name. "I promised my father I would find a wife before winter," he said, "and I found you." He paused. What I promised him and what I found were not the same thing. He expected someone who would fit into the life that was already here. And instead I found someone who built a new life alongside the one that was here, and made everything larger. He looked at her directly in the way he had always looked at her, with the full attention that she had recognized from the beginning as one of his most essential qualities. "I want you to know that I have been grateful for that every single day for 34 years. Lenora looked at him across the space between their horses with the gray eyes that had never stopped being precise and never stopped being warm under the precision. And she thought about everything contained in those 34 years. The grief and the work and the children and the arguments resolved, and the evenings on the porch and the canary singing in the early morning, and the old man in his parlor chair with his clear dark eyes. And the November morning 34 years ago, when she had sat in a wagon for the first time riding toward a ranch she had never seen with a man she barely knew. And the ranch had come into view against the brown hills, and she had said it was beautiful and meant it in a way that was already about more than the landscape. "Ezekiel," she said, "you did not find me, I found you, in the middle of a muddy street arguing with a canary." The corner of her mouth moved. "I assessed you in the first 30 seconds and decided you were worth my time." He smiled at her, the full smile, the one she had been cataloging for 34 years and was still finding dimensions of. "I know," he said, "and I have been grateful for your assessment every single day since." She reached across the space between them and he reached back, and their hands met over the fence post in the November air, and the creek ran below them and the hills stretched away in every direction in the particular enormous distances of Wyoming. And the sky was the deep blue it always was in November, clear and cold, and absolutely merciless about anything except beauty. And the two of them held onto each other's hands in the middle of all of it, as they had held onto each other across 34 years of all of it, with the undiminished strength of people who had decided long ago that this was worth holding. They rode back to the house in the afternoon light, which laid itself across the land in the long gold of November afternoons, and the ranch was there where they left it, Neil's wagon in the yard, and the smoke from the chimney rising straight up in the still air, and the sound of Thomas somewhere on the south side of the barn, and the whole accumulated weight of a life well built standing around them in the cold, bright air of November in Wyoming, which was exactly where Cornelius Hayes had always intended it to be. Inside, the fire was going and the coffee was on, and Lenora took off her coat and hat and set about making the evening meal with the ease of a woman in her own home. And Ezekiel came and stood in the kitchen doorway the way he had stood in kitchen doorways all his adult life and watched her. And she knew he was there the way she had always known he was there, sensing it in the quality of the air and the particular feeling of being fully seen. They had supper together that evening, the two of them, with Thomas coming in from outside and Neil and Ruth, and their children coming from the main house, which happened regularly on November evenings when the cold made company more welcome than solitude. The table was full, and the lamp was lit, and the conversation went in all the directions that a table full of people across 3 generations will send it. And afterward there was pie that Ruth had made and coffee and more conversation. And the children of Neil and Ruth, who were Ezekiel and Lenora's grandchildren, moved through the warm house with the unconscious ease of children who have never known anything but homes that held them well. When everyone had gone and the house was quiet and Ezekiel was banking the fire for the night, Lenora sat in the chair by the south window with a book open in her lap, and the lamplight was warm on the page, and outside the Wyoming night was vast and cold and full of stars that were unpolluted by anything and therefore relentless in their number. "Come to bed," Ezekiel said. "One more page," she said. He sat down across from her in the other chair, the one he had always occupied, and waited, the way he had always waited, with the patience of a man who knew that one more page sometimes meant 3 more pages, and that this was entirely acceptable because the life they had made together had room in it for 3 more pages. She read her page, and then another, and then she closed the book and set it on the table between the 2 chairs and looked at him across the lamp with the gray eyes she had been looking at him with for 34 years. And the light was the same warm lamp light it had always been, and the house around them held all its decades of living, and the night outside was enormous and indifferent and full of stars. "You were not what my father pictured," Ezekiel said one last time quietly as the fire settled in the grate. "No," she agreed. "I was what you needed, which is a different matter entirely. He reached across the space between the chairs, across the lamp and the books and the 34 years, and she took his hand, and they sat together in the quiet house on the Wyoming ranch that had been built by a man who died hoping his son would not be alone, and the son was not alone, and had never been, and the promise that had been made beside a south-facing window in the autumn of 1882 had been kept in full, and more than kept, in ways that neither Ezekiel Hayes nor Cornelius Hayes had pictured. But then the best things never quite are.